Hi, everyone. Welcome to this eSchool News webinar, Better Substitute Management, an Integrated Approach. My name is Dennis Pierce, and I'll be moderating the event. I'm the former editor of eSchool News. I'm now a freelance education writer, and I'm excited to have you join us for what should be a very informative session. Today's webinar is sponsored by Kronos, a global leader in delivering workforce management solutions in the cloud. Tens of thousands of organizations in more than 100 countries, including more than 600 educational institutions, use Kronos to control their labor costs, minimize compliance risk, and improve workforce productivity. Before I introduce our presenter, I'd like to take a minute to go over a few quick logistical items. Today's event will be recorded, so you don't have to worry about missing anything. Within a few days of the event, you'll receive an email message that contains a link to the recorded webinar, along with a PDF of the slides. You can submit questions at any time during the presentation by clicking on the Q&A link at the bottom of the screen. There will be time at the end of the presentation for our panelists to address questions. Also, there's a group chat function that you can launch by clicking on the chat link at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to use this feature to chat among yourselves or to contact someone from the eSchool News team if you have a technical question. But please don't use this feature to ask questions of our speaker. If you have a question for the speaker, you can use the Q&A link that I just mentioned. With these items out of the way, let's get started with our presentation. Sorry. There we go. Our presenter today is Rob Tibbs, K-12 industry consultant for Kronos. Rob leverages his strong background in education to help school districts get the most value from their Kronos solutions. Before joining Kronos, he was director of payroll for the Jefferson County School District in Alabama, with 6,000 full-time and part-time employees, including substitutes. In that role, he successfully transitioned Jefferson County schools from a manual paper-based time management system to an automated state-of-the-art workforce solution. We were scheduled to have another presenter as well. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to join us. So Rob will be doing all the heavy lifting himself, but he'll be drawing upon his many years of experience in the Jefferson County schools, and he provides a unique perspective having served in multiple roles. So he's well versed in the challenges we'll be talking about today from a school district perspective. We're going to be talking about the challenges of managing substitute employees, especially from an accounting perspective. And we're going to be looking at how school district administrators can more effectively answer three key questions in particular. Who are substitutes covering for? What are the actual hours they're working? And where are they at any given time? So we're going to start with the who, and I'd like to frame the conversation just by observing that substitute employees have a very large presence in schools in the United States. As you can see in this slide, there were more than 500,000 substitute teachers working in US elementary and secondary schools as of May 2018, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And a report that came out several years ago from the Department of Education noted that teachers are absent for an average of 9.4 days during a typical 180-day school year. Some of this leave time is for illness, and some is for professional learning or because they're chaperoning a student event or travel. But this means substitutes are called in to cover for about 5% of a teacher's working days on average. Substitutes also fill in for other school district employees, such as bus drivers and paraprofessionals. Some substitutes work in multiple roles throughout the school year or even during a single day. Managing all of these employees and keeping accurate records for such a fluid workforce can be challenging, especially when it comes to payroll. And even with an automated substitute management system in place, there's still room for better accuracy and accountability. So Rob, I'd like to kick off the conversation by asking you, why is it important for school systems to have more visibility into the who substitutes are covering for in particular?
Yeah, Dennis. So like you said, school districts, work with many substitutes on a day-to-day basis. And the importance of knowing who is because typically most districts pay the substitute from the funding source of the person that they're working for. So like you said, substitutes work for teachers, they may work for bus drivers, they may work for paraprofessionals, and linking the sub to who they're working for is critically important in school districts. And so while that linkage happens in a substitute management system, that is from a scheduling perspective, and where a workforce management system comes into play and helps with that is you're able to ensure that they actually show up to work, and the scheduling tool integrates with the workforce management system and ensures that they actually show up to work, and you can ensure that the substitute is paid from the proper funding source to ensure that budgets are allocated appropriately.
So you mentioned that a lot of times schools systems will want to, well, obviously all school systems want to make sure subs are paid from the appropriate pool of money. How, in your experience, how is that typically handled in a school system?
Yes, so I've been able to work with a lot of districts as I've come on board with Kronos, and most districts do exactly what I said. They pay the teacher or the sub from the teacher or the employee's funding source. But I have encountered a few other ways that school districts pay the substitutes. A couple of other ways that I have seen is some districts just have a sub pool that they will pay the subs from. This makes it a little bit easier, but I find that school districts do this because they don't have the technology and the tools in place to effectively manage it, and so they pay from a pool and then end up having on the back end to reallocate and charge the right funds. And so with a substitute management system and a workforce management system, it helps streamline that to avoid the need for doing a sub pool or something like that. The other interesting thing that I've seen is some districts will push sub budgets to the school level and have budgets managed by principals at the school for substitutes, and principals are able to manage their own budgets for substitutes. And what I have found with that is you still are able to allocate subs from the special revenue funds and things like that. So the linking to the sub and the teacher is important, but it's managed at the school level. It's reconciled at the school level, and the principals pay more attention to it because it's their budget, they manage it, and any potential surplus that's left over in the budget, a lot of times the schools allow that to then roll over into a principal reserve or something that the schools are able to leverage themselves. And so having something like that in place sometimes allows for potentially a decrease in absenteeism, and allows for them to pay more attention to what's happening with the sub budget and things like that. But at the end of the day, no matter which way you do it, it still goes back to the importance of tracking the sub to the employee they're working for the budget, and ensuring that you're paying the sub from the right funding source.
You mentioned that a lot of districts want to make sure subs are, well, it's handled in several different ways, but one key way that you see is when a school system wants to make sure subs are paid from the same funding source as the teacher. Can you give some examples of cases where that might be, where a teacher's position might be paid from a certain pool of money that the district wants to make sure the sub is paid from that same pool of money?
Yeah, for sure. And a good example is a lot of districts have title funds and Title I funds, or federal funds. And if you have a Title I funded teaching unit, or any federally funded unit, um, you can allocate funds for those teaching units to pay for subs when they're out of the classroom. And so, if those teachers are out, the substitute can be paid from those funds as well if budgeted. And so that's a perfect example of how, if you follow the process and have these allocations done appropriately and link the sub to the teacher, you're able to leverage those special revenue funds to pay substitutes. And instead of it coming just from a sub pool or from your general fund.
So what are the key challenges involved in making that linkage between the sub and the teacher effectively?
I think the key challenge, I think number one is you need a substitute management system. And I think most districts have that. And then I think where the other challenge comes into play is, it's a scheduling solution. And so you have to reconcile and ensure that the sub actually showed up, worked, and worked. And then there's so many things that happen, at the school level day to day, and they principals end up needing to swap, subs around, move them around, make adjustments, and that's where a workforce management solution comes into play, where the reconciliation in essence happens for them because we're tracking actually what happens. And so, yes, the substitute management system is a great scheduling tool, paired with the workforce management solution, helps streamline and take a lot of the headache away. Whereas without that, that is where, to me, the biggest challenge comes into play, because you're trying to reconcile something manually to ensure that what was scheduled actually happened.
So how does that actually occur when you integrate a substitute management system with an automated workforce management solution? Can you kind of walk us through how that linkage takes place and how everything is simpler in keeping track of that?
Yeah, so what happens is, with an integrated approach with a substitute management system and a workforce management system, the substitute schedule is automatically integrated into the workforce management solution. So the assignment that occurs in the substitute management system automatically updates the schedule in the workforce management solution, indicating not only the schedule, what time they're supposed to be there, 8 to 3, for example, but it also indicates the location, the school that they're supposed to work at, and the person they're working for. So the teacher, the bus driver, the paraprofessional, whomever they are substituting for, so that the workforce management solution knows all that information and can validate when they actually show up, and can validate that they actually did work the designated time that they were scheduled to work.
So when information is entered on an absence in a substitute management system, and the automated workforce management solution pulls that information automatically, and then the teacher and the sub are linked together in the record, and everything that's happening in the automated workforce management solution gets linked to that substitute as well, including the rules on the back end for how that position is how those hours are being paid, from what pool of money that those hours are being paid, and so on. Is that an accurate way to describe it?
That is correct, yes. And so because the sub is linked to the teacher, there's not a need for the sub to know that the teacher is funded from Title I or from the general fund or from, you know, any other fund for that matter. Because behind the scenes, through the integration with not only the sub management system, but also the payroll financial system, behind the scenes, we link and know that that teacher is funded from, you know, Title I or whatever funding source. And so when that is passed to payroll, we link and pay the sub from the appropriate funding source based on that link between the sub and the teacher. And so all we need is that linkage to ensure that that it's paid from the proper funding source.
When that linkage isn't automated through the integration with an automated workforce management solution, how have you seen school districts handle that with like a paper-based system?
It still happens. It's just very manual, and it's manual entry. And so, you know, the best example I have is before we transitioned to Kronos at my district, we still linked the sub to the teacher, but it was on paper. And so the sub signed in. So we had, you know, a substitute management system. That link happened in that system, but we had to have the sub sign in on the teacher timesheet so that we had the validation that they actually worked. And then we had to manually cross-reference that. And then we had to manually key that into our payroll system. And when we manually keyed it into our payroll system, we linked the sub to the teacher's absence when we keyed it into our payroll system. And when we did that, that's how the link happened, and the sub got paid from the funding source of the teacher because of the way we keyed it into our payroll system. And so that's, you know, my example, but from my experience working with so many other districts now that, you know, I work as a consultant and work with so many other districts, it works very similarly with them as well. And so that's, you know, just the best example I have. It was just a very manual, labor intensive process. Whereas what I've described with technology and an integrated approach with substitute management, workforce management together, it's just fully automates the process.
And I would imagine that manual cross-referencing process that you just referred to not only takes more time, but could also be prone to error.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you know, we spent a lot of time and a lot of labor hours in payroll, and felt like it was pretty accurate, but it was definitely prone to error for sure.
Okay, thanks. Let's move on to the what portion of the presentation. So when we talk about the what of substitute management, we're talking about what specific hours substitutes are working. So Rob, why is that important to keep careful track of, and what are the key challenges in answering that question effectively?
Yeah, so we've talked about the importance of linking the sub to the teacher, and we've talked about the fact that now in, you know, in the workforce management system, we have the schedule, and we know who the sub is supposed to work for, and the designated schedule and the hours that they're supposed to work. But when we think about the what, and we think about the importance of knowing the hours for the sub, what we have found through working with so many districts is that it's important to track the actual hours of the substitute. So instead of having the substitute management system automatically pay the substitute based on the assignment, have the substitute punch in and punch out and pay the substitute for the time that they worked versus the time that was really allocated in the assignment. And that doesn't mean changing your pay schedule or your pay policy in relation to how you pay subs, because by and large, most districts pay substitutes on a full day, half day schedule. I'm not saying you change that, but what I'm saying is track what the sub works. And if they punched in and punched out and it allocates or constitutes a whole day, then you pay them a whole day. If it constitutes a half day, it's a half day. But base it on what they work versus what they were scheduled or the absence of the teacher. And just through working with so many districts in that transformation, what we have found is around 8% of the time, subs end up not working the same amount of hours or time as the teacher or employee was designated to be off. So for example, teacher took a full day off, but the sub ended up only working a half day. And it doesn't mean that the sub, didn't work the hours for negative reasons. There's so many reasons that we found, because it may have been a last minute call out to the sub and it bypassed the sub management system. The sub didn't get there till 10 o'clock and they ended up leaving early because the teacher had a last period off. Or we found that substitutes were working for coaches and they had, the last 2 period athletics. There were just so many scenarios that we found that were not necessarily negative reasons, but they were not working the full day. But then there were also reasons, that they ended up leaving, but they had a full assignment in the substitute management system and would have been paid the full day. So we just found that it's more accurate if you track the hours that they work and pay the sub full day, half day based on what they work versus the scheduled assignment. And on top of that, you also get actual hours worked for the substitute from an FLSA and ACA perspective. And so you have a record and a timesheet for the sub so that that, if they become benefited, you have an accurate representation and know that they're benefit eligible or not, because most districts, substitutes are not benefit eligible.
So to use the example that you cited then, if a substitute, because it was a last minute call out and it might have taken time for to line up the sub, the sub who arrives at 10 a.m. and the first few periods were covered a different way, and then maybe they left because the teacher didn't have class, a last period class, even though without an accurate record of that, the district might pay the sub for a full day when the sub really worked a half day. And if he or she was punching in and out, the district would have a better way to see that and pay the appropriate amount.
That's correct. Yeah. If the district has a policy of, paying the employees based on what they work, then they have better insight, better visibility into what they're actually working by following the model that I just described versus just paying them for what they're scheduled to work.
Okay. And without a workforce solution in place where employees are punching in and out, typically a district would just go by what the original teacher was scheduled that the sub was filling in for.
In most cases, that's what I'm finding that most districts do. Like I said, some districts will have substitutes sign in on paper and they can manually write in their time. But again, in most cases, they're signing in. But again, if you try to do what I just described on paper, that cross reference is very labor intensive and takes a lot of time to cross reference and check.
What does that punching in and out process look like? What does it involve?
So it actually makes it very easy because of the integration with the substitute management system. So it just requires the sub to, simply utilize some device, whether that be a, terminal or a Chromebook, a mobile device, a PC, just to check in and say they're there, and check out to say they're gone for the day, because the schedule in the system does everything else. And so by them checking in, checking out, everything else happens automatically because of the integration with the substitute management system to say that they were scheduled to be there, they were scheduled to be at X school, and they were scheduled to be for whichever teacher or whichever employee.
Okay. You mentioned that roughly 8% of the time in your experience, subs don't end up working the same amount of time that the original employee that they're covering for was scheduled. Do you know where that figure comes from? And do you have a sense for if school systems were keeping more accurate record of the actual hours that subs are working, what kind of potential cost savings there could be into that?
Yeah, so that figure, I just worked with several school districts on implementing this practice, and we went back and looked at historical data to arrive at that number. And by working with several school districts, that was the average number. Some districts were a little bit higher, some districts were a little bit lower, but when I took them together, the average was around 8%. So that's where that number came from, just by working with districts to implement this process and looking at their historical data. And then, to arrive at a potential cost savings, most of them just looked at their substitute budget and, took that 8% of their substitute budget.
Okay, thanks. We're going to move on to the next aspect of the presentation, which is the where of substitute management. Just knowing where substitutes are each day, and are they actually in the building at any given moment. Can you talk about why it's important for school district personnel to be able to answer this question?
Yeah, so continuing the theme and talking about the fact that with substitute management, it's a scheduling solution. And so having the substitutes check in and check out, the other value in that is exactly this, knowing where and knowing who's in the building. And so if you have them check in and check out, without a doubt that they're in the building. So from an on-premise security perspective, who's in your building, and including substitutes. And so with a workforce management solution deployed across your district, you want to ensure that as a principal, you can run a security on-premise type report and know who's in your building. And you want that to include substitutes because as we talked about at the beginning of the presentation, substitutes are vital to the success of a school district. And you want to know on any given day what substitutes are at your school. And just because they're scheduled to be there doesn't mean that they are actually there that day, or that they're in that actual classroom that day, because then they may have to move them around and things like that. So by integrating with workforce management, you're able to not only ensure that they check in and check out, and you know that they're on premise, but you know for sure which classroom that they're in. And so at any given moment, a principal can run in a dashboard view or a report and know who's on premise to include the substitutes.
So in the event of an emergency, obviously it's critical that principals can know really kind of at a glance who's in the building or who was in the building at the time, so they can make sure everyone is accounted for. And to go back to your scenario before about if a substitute maybe arrived late or left early, or their hours didn't exactly match what the person they were covering for. If a principal was just going by a substitute management system, it might show that the person that the substitute should be reporting to the building. But unless they're actually punching in and out, it's difficult to know exactly if they're in the building at a given moment. Is that correct?
That's exactly correct.
And so, but if they had an automated workforce management solution, they could run a report showing at any given time who's punched in, who's punched out, things like that.
That's correct. They can have a dashboard view that's updated instantly, that can be monitored, or a report can be run at any given time. And I've worked with many districts and unfortunately had situations where our system has been leveraged in emergency situations to be able to know, and in an instance run a report for emergency personnel to know who's in the building.
And so in some schools where it's they might I know of some schools that might handle some, they might have a physical sign-in sheet or sign-out sheet when substitutes arrive and other people arrive in the building, and then, sign out when they leave. What are some of the challenges of handling it that way, and why is that not a sufficient way to handle knowing who's in the building at any given time necessarily?
Well, I think it's some of like what we've already talked about from a record keeping perspective. It becomes a nightmare and an administrative burden, but from a wear perspective, it would require someone to go get that notebook or that piece of paper and analyze it to determine to know who's there. And if it's just a routine situation, where principals just want to know what subs are there, that may work fine. But if it's an emergency situation, time is of the essence, and it could be, critical to know in any given moment, and there may not be time. And so that's where I would say there's a challenge. And then the other value that comes to mind in having a solution versus a sign-in sheet is there's visibility to this data across the district. And so not only would the principal have visibility to it, but the admin office and the district personnel could have visibility into this as well. And so there's other access that can be granted and other visibility into this as well, which I think is also of tremendous value.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I would imagine too, like if there's an evacuation, like people have to actually leave the building, you might not think to grab a sign-in sheet, whereas with a cloud-based dashboard, the principal could just be accessing it from a mobile phone in the parking lot or something.
Or tablet, yep, that's exactly right.
Okay. So I think we covered the who, we covered the what, we covered the where. Thanks for your insights, Rob. To summarize what I think I heard from you, keeping an accurate record of the hours that substitute employees work, and also who they're covering for, so that districts know what funding source they should be paid from, and then obviously where they are at any given time, are important. Trying to keep careful record of that can be challenging, and a substitute management system by itself wouldn't necessarily help administrators answer those questions. But when you integrate a substitute management system with an automated workforce system, it becomes a lot easier to keep track of all this information and improve accountability. Is that the gist of what we talked about?
It is. It's a great wrap up.
Good. So I think we have plenty of time to answer questions. If anybody has questions for Rob and has not already done so, you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. This would be the time to do that if you haven't already. Going to kick off the Q&A with a question from a participant. If a substitute works multiple jobs within one day, how can this be tracked, and how would I make sure they're paid from the proper funding source?
So I'll answer that a couple of different ways. First, if they're working in multiple substitute positions, it will follow very much like what we've talked about this whole time. So it's very common that, a sub may take 2 half-day positions, and everything that we talked about would be consistent. They would just be working 1/2 of the day for one person and 1/2 day for the other person. But I do think that this brings up another very valid point, that there are some substitutes that also work other jobs for the school district. So they may do after school care tutoring, they may take up tickets at a ball game, and that makes it even more critical, in my opinion, to have a workforce management solution, because you want to be able to track all hours that they're working in one location, one timesheet, and you don't want to have all these timesheets floating around. You want to ensure you know what they're working. And so if they are working multiple jobs and they're substituting, then when they're working the additional jobs, they'll simply transfer to those jobs, and the allocation or the funding source will be automatically allocated based on the linkage to the payroll system. And then, of course, like we talked about, they will be properly paid. The sub will be properly paid from the right funding source because of the link between the sub and the teacher.
Okay. So each person's role is defining what pool of money they'd be paid for. That's like based on the rule in the back end of the system. So when that linkage occurs, it's pulling from the appropriate funding source automatically.
Right.
Okay. Someone else asks, can I pull reports on my substitute data to use in audits or in other compliance efforts?
Yes. If you want to leverage either system to pull reports, you can. But if you follow the process that I've described, and you end up having subs punch in and punch out, and you want to use that data, you can absolutely pull reports out of a workforce management system to see what the sub actually worked, who they worked for, and indicate, based on location, based on who they worked for, based on funding sources and all those type things. The other nice thing is you can run, it's, in the budget world, it's more like budget to actual type reports, but you can run, substitute schedule versus actual type reports. So you can see, it goes back to the 8% that I was talking about. You can see, based on schedule versus actual, how many substitutes are working, what they were scheduled versus what they were, what are they actually working versus what they were scheduled as well.
Okay. How often can a substitute management system and a workforce management system feed information back and forth? Does this happen once a day or in real time, or how does that work?
So it can happen as often as you would like. There's a variety of substitute management systems out there, and depending on the integration that is set up will depend on that answer. If it's just a flat file feed, you can just set it up to go once a day or as frequent as you want. And then there's also API integration that is the real time, and we have both set up with different substitute management providers. So the short answer is all of the above. So it depends on, which substitute management system and which workforce management system. But basically, you can do any or all, anything that you really want.
Does Kronos integrate with any substitute management system?
Yes.
Great. I don't see any other questions in the queue right now. I'll just give people like a few seconds if you want to ask one last question of Rob. While we're waiting, I'm just going to wrap things up. I'd like to thank our presenter, Rob Tibbs, for a very informative presentation today. And I'd like to thank all of the audience members for joining us as well. As a reminder, you'll get an email within the next few days that contains a link to the recording of this presentation along with the slides. And so thanks again, everybody, for participating. Have a great day.